basically what I'm doing here is over the last couple of months, I've had a number of people email me and send me messages about how to get started in FPV, and why I'm not sure. I guess because I put some videos up there, but I'm not an expert by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not even what I'd consider intermediate. I'm still a novice at this, but I have learned a lot over the last year of building and flying FPVs. I've crashed a many FPV plane. I've lost one or two accidentally. So I kind of got a little bit of knowledge, and if I can share that, pass it on to somebody else just trying to get started out in this hobby, that's great. I'll be happy with that. Okay, over the last year, probably the most important thing I've learned about designing, building, flying FPV is when you're getting started out, keep your system very, very simple. Just the bare minimum that you need to get that plane in the air, flying, and get your video back down to your ground station. The more bells and whistles you add up front, the more challenging it's going to be to get everything working right, and you really want to start out with just a plane, an RC control system, a video transmitter receiver with a camera, and some kind of a monitor that you can watch your video on the ground. The rest of the electronics and all the cool automation and this and that, save that for later. Learn to fly the plane first, and then you can venture out, and it'll be money well spent to do it that way. One of the biggest questions that I see on various forums that's asked repeatedly over and over again, and I've asked the question myself a number of times, is what is the best airplane for FPV? What kind of plane should I buy to fly FPV for the first time? It's a very subjective question, and if you ask 100 people what the best FPV plane is, you're going to get at least 50 different answers. Because one person will say plane A is great, plane B stinks. The next guy is going to say plane B is great, plane A stinks. It's a very subjective thing. The bottom line about the airplane is the best airplane for you to fly FPV is the plane that you are most comfortable flying. You need to get an airplane frame that's very stable and that you're comfortable with in the air. The easier it is for you to fly and the more comfortable you are, the better experience you're going to have with this whole hobby. So I was told the best plane for FPV is to get the Easy Star, the multiplex Easy Star, and fly that plane. I bought it. I didn't like it at all. It just didn't suit my flying style. I don't know why. I just couldn't get into that plane at all. So I've scratch built a number of FPV planes. I've used flying wings. I've got a Skywalker back here on my bench behind me that I'm building now. But again, the bottom line is get a plane that you're comfortable flying and use that. That's the best way to get started. The next thing is your flight control system, your radio control system. What are you going to use to fly this plane? Your options really are 2.4 gigahertz, which pretty much everybody uses these days. It's good if you have a lot of people out there. You can have a lot of people flying without shooting each other down. It has some pluses in that it's simple and it's readily available, but it's got some minuses for FPV, and really your range is pretty limited with 2.4 gigahertz. The other issue with 2.4 is when you get a control glitch with 2.4, you're not going to really get any warning that it's about to happen. You're just going to lose signal, and you have no control of your plane at that point. You get no opportunity to know something's about to happen and turn around and fly home, or fly a little bit closer to you. So that can be problematic. It's really easy to get away from you. Fly farther than you think you're flying when you're flying FPV. So you really want a good radio system. What I've switched to is my JR radio. I put a 72 megahertz FM module in there, and I'm using 72 megahertz now to fly. The advantages of 72 is that you're going to be able to get better range with your airplane than you would be with a 2.4 gigahertz. And you're also going to get glitching when you start to get out of range. So your servos might start twitching a little bit. You'll notice some odd behavior with your airplane, and that's a little bit of forewarning that you've got a problem and you probably should turn around and start heading um, back towards home. So other than dealing with that big freaking antenna on the top of my transmitter, I like using 72 megahertz. It's pretty much well within my limit of where I want to fly, usually about a mile, mile and a half out. I don't want to really go much further than that right now. So it works for me. So consider thinking about 72 megahertz. Also, you've got a lot of options for video transmitters if you're using 72 megahertz, and they're not going to interfere with your radio control system, depending on the video transmitter that you use on your plane. Your other option later on, if you want to get out further, and I'm talking flying miles and miles and miles away from yourself, is you can use one of the long-range transmitter systems that plugs into your regular radio transmitter. Talking about the Chain Link or the Dragon Link, or there's probably 4 or 5 others out there that are on the market, and I think they use 433 megahertz, and people are flying like multiple miles away from themselves. That's a little bit advanced for me, so I'm not even considering that right now. Might be something I'd be interested in trying at some point in the future, but I'm still learning how to keep the plane close to me and keep it in the air right now. So the next thing you're going to need is you're going to need a good video transmitter system, a transmitter and a receiver. And it doesn't really have to be an expensive one, although the more money you pay, the better quality you get. There are some pretty decent affordable systems on some of the FPV specialty websites out there. So check around like Foxtech or Range Video and other places like that. Check around and see what you can afford. Get the best you can afford, obviously. You're going to have a choice of 900 megahertz, I think a 1.3 gigahertz, 2.4 gigahertz, and 5.8 gigahertz. Each has its advantages and disadvantages. I started out with 900 megahertz. I still have that system. I have recently switched though to 5.8 gigahertz, and the reason I did that is because I needed smaller antennas. I'd like to have smaller antennas. The lower the frequency, the bigger your antennas are going to start getting. So 5.8 is they're really tiny antennas, really easy to deal with. So I've switched to 5.8 gigahertz, and I'm using a 200 milliwatt transmitter, and that should be all I need, really, to keep myself within a mile and a half. We'll see. Now I can always get a more powerful transmitter if I need to for that 5.8 gigahertz. But I like the video on it so far. So whenever you get your video transmitter and your receiver, more than likely it's going to come with a little tiny rubber duck or tiny whip antenna, which should be fine if you're just starting out, because you're going to want to keep that plane close to you. You're around a park or a small field or whatever, and not really venture out too far, so you should be doing okay. But you'll probably soon realize that you're going to want to upgrade those antennas depending on how you fly. And there's a number of different types of antennas you can go with. Probably the most popular out there today is IB Crazy's skew planar antenna for your receiver, and the cloverleaf for your transmitter. These are little antennas that you can make at home if you have soldering skills, and it's not complicated to do. It's really important that you measure your lengths of wire. And if you get on the internet and Google IB Crazy skew planar circular polarized antennas, these are actually circular polarized antennas. And I'll explain kind of in basic terms what that is in just a second. But do a search for IB Crazy circular polarized antennas, and it'll take you to probably an RC Groups thread where you can learn how to build these antennas. And just with a minimum investment of time and money, the results are going to be really, really good, over and above what you could ever get with the standard linear polarized antennas that come with your transmitter and your receiver. Basically what happens with the linear polarized antenna is if both antennas are straight up and down, you can get a decent signal and you can get it all the way around your base station. But when you go to bank your plane, your antenna turns and then you alter your polarization between the transmitter and the receiver, and then you're going to have a hard time getting video like that until you straighten things back up. So that's kind of what the issue is with those antennas, as I understand it. Now, if I'm wrong, feel free to jump in there and add to it, but that's the layman's simple terms. With your circular polarized antennas, your transmission's got kind of a corkscrew type of a wave to it. So when you turn your plane sideways, your polarization is still acceptable. So it's still an omnidirectional antenna, so you can go all the way around your base station, but you'll get much better video transmission and much better video reception from your airplane, with the exception, I believe, of if you're directly above your base station. That's probably your dead zone there, but not too bad. I think for the investment in time and money that it takes to make that, which is minimal, it's a lot better antenna. Your other option for antennas is going to be directional antenna, and that's the patch type antenna. And you'll probably be able to get much further range with a patch antenna, but being that it is directional, it's only going to be looking in one section of the sky, so you have to keep that antenna pointed at your airplane or you're going to lose your signal. So the options are to fly away from yourself and fly back with your patch pointed at your plane, or you're going to have to reposition your antenna as you're flying, and that's just not really an option unless you get some of the cool electronics that will automatically position your antenna, antenna tracker, which will follow your plane with your antenna for you. That's probably the coolest and the best way to go if you want to go long range. But I think for getting started out, just try your whips to get started, the little rubber ducky antennas, and look at those I'd Be Crazy circular polarized antennas. Probably for 90% of the people, that's going to be all you need, and it's going to work great for you. The other thing really quick to touch on here is when you're orienting your antenna on your airplane, you want to pay attention to which direction your plane is going to be to have the best signal. And by that I mean, if you're going to be receiving the best signal as your plane's flying away from you, you'll theoretically get to a point where you're flying out no problem. When you turn around to come home, you lose video signal. That's a bad thing to happen, because more than likely you're going to lose your plane. If you're that far away and you have no video, you clearly can't fly back. So pay attention to how you mount your antennas, and you really want your strongest signal coming from the front of the plane. So as you fly out and you start losing video signal, all you have to do is turn around and you're going to get a better signal for flying home. So you'll be sure to have video for your return trip home. So just a little note there when you're mounting your hardware into your airplane. Now that's pretty much all you need to get started. One of the other items that go in your plane, or it's actually a group of electronics, is an OSD system, which is an on-screen display. And usually they come with a GPS, they come with a battery current sensor, and what they'll do is they'll monitor your plane's battery packs, how much juice you have in there, how much have you taken out, so you know exactly how much juice you have to fly. And they'll also monitor your location. They'll give you airspeed, altitude, direction. They'll have an indicator for what direction you need to come home. So if you get lost out there, you can just fly by wire or fly by your OSD back. Really good to have when you're ready to leave the park setting. Probably don't want to get started with it, because it can be a little bit daunting to fly around looking at all these numbers and all this data coming from your airplane. And it really, the more you focus on that OSD data, the less you're focusing on where you're flying and what you're flying into and where your horizon is and all that good stuff. It's always better to probably kind of learn your landmarks first and fly by landmark in a local area before you venture out and need the OSD. But you'll probably want to get one of those pretty soon. There's a bunch of different ones out there on the market. My personal preference is an OSD with the least amount of data on the screen. I don't like a cluttered screen with numbers everywhere. I just want one little section that shows me how fast I'm going, how high I am, what direction I'm going, where's my home indicator, and tell me about my video and my flight battery packs. That's really what I need to know. And I like that tucked out of the way so I can get a clear view of where I'm flying. Also consider that some of these things, if you spend a little bit more money, you can get a return to home function. And I think that's really, really cool for kind of not a real expensive insurance policy to hopefully get your plane back if you ever have a problem. And what this return to home function does is if you ever get out to a point where you lose your video signal or you get into trouble and you can't fly back, with a flick of a switch on your transmitter, your plane will fly home by itself. And what it does is it uses that OSD data and it knows where it started out, and it turns around and it tries to keep its altitude constant, and it starts flying back towards you. And when it gets to you, it'll circle around overhead, and you can turn your transmitter on, get control of that thing, and land it safely. So, short of spending hours, days, weeks, and sometimes months traipsing through woods looking for an airplane, that's pretty cool to have the ability to have that plane fly back to you autonomously if you need to. So look into that as well. Again, that's more of a bell and a whistle kind of a thing that you're going to want to look for after you get comfortable flying your airplane. Okay, the last thing you're going to need is something to monitor your camera on at your ground station. You're going to want some video goggles, you're going to want a monitor, you're going to want a DVD player, something of that nature to see where you're flying. That's what it's all about. I don't use video goggles. I use, this 13-inch TV. It is very small, yet big enough to see where I'm going. It's very light. It's battery powered. I can take it out to the field, plug a LiPo in there, and I'm good to go. I've not used video goggles. It's something that I probably will look into in the future just to see. I may like them. Some people like them, some people don't. Many people use them. A decent pair is quite an investment, in the probably $300-400 range. So that's kind of on the back burner for me right now. I just don't feel like dropping that kind of coin on a pair of glasses when I can use a TV similar to that. One of the things you're really going to look for when you're using the display, this is something that I struggled with a lot, is many of the TVs or displays, they have a blue screen or a black screen function. And what that is when the video signal gets kind of scratchy and you start losing signal, that TV will cut to a blue screen. And it will rather show a blue screen than static. Now, if you're watching TV, that's a cool thing because who really wants to look at a screen full of static? But if you're flying FPV, that's a really, really, really bad thing because you want to see through the static for as long as possible because you got a plane up in the air somewhere far away from you. And if your TV monitor goes to blue screen, you got no control over that plane while that's happening. If you do have a return to home, you can flick the switch at that time. But you really want a system that'll show as much static as possible. And I've gone through a couple of different monitors. I've got some really nice computer monitors, and they work really well. They're really big, but they got terrible blue screen issues. So for the longest time, I actually used a 13-inch CRT TV, a little 13-inch television that has no blue screen in it. Shows all the static in the world, and the problem with it is it's heavy, it's bulky, it's ugly, and I have to use a power inverter on my vehicle out in the field to power it because it doesn't run off of batteries. So that's out the window. I bought this little TV right here, this little 13-inch TV, and so far while it does blue screen, it really shows a fair amount of static before it goes to blue screen, and when you get the signal back, it comes back instantly. So I think that might work for me, but I have a backup plan to get rid of 100% of the blue screen. I have purchased, you can't see it, but I have an RF modulator. And basically what that does is it takes my video signal and it sends it to channel 3 on the TV, channel 4 selectable, 3 or 4. And you've probably seen these that for, you know, the old style video games, you plug them into your TV and you can send it to the, well, depending on how old you are, you may have seen, you may not know what I'm talking about. But basically, instead of sending a video signal to a video input on the TV, it'll take your video signal that coming in and send it to channel 3 or channel 4 on the TV tuner. And the advantage of this is you turn your TV to channel 3, you get your video signal, it shows 100% static, and it bypasses that blue screen, because as far as the TV knows, it's getting a signal, it just doesn't know that it's transmitting static. So that's also a little battery operated device that I can Velcro on the back of the TV, and it's worked quite well. So okay, once you have your system set up, you got your plane, you got your RC control system, you got your video transmitter, receiver, you have your monitor. I guess the last thing we haven't talked about is a camera. Some systems come with a camera that goes on your airplane. Usually you're going to have to buy that separately, and those range from, you know, probably $10 to $50, $60, $100, depending on what you want. I can tell you a little bit about the different types of cameras out there. The better camera you have, the more it's gonna, the easier it's gonna be adjusting from the light of the sky versus the darkness of the ground. Basically, one of the big problems you have with the cheaper cameras is if you're flying along and you have your horizon and your sky is really bright and the ground is really dark, and it's going to compensate for that bright sky, and your ground is going to be completely dark. You're not going to be able to see it until you point your plane down and have it readjust the brightness so you can see your ground. And that's really not a good way to fly FPV. So spend a little money, get a decent camera. You can do some research out there and see what other people are using, but you're going to want to get a halfway decent FPV camera. The only other consideration for the camera is I like to mount my camera on a pan servo. And what that does is I just have my camera mounted on the top of a servo. And since I fly with a monitor, I don't have a head tracker. You can buy this head tracker where when you turn your head, it actually turns your camera on the plane, which is really cool. But you really need the goggles for that, because when you turn your head, you can see left and right. What I do is most of my planes, I don't fly with a rudder, so I just use ailerons and elevator control, and I use my rudder channel to operate my camera pan. It lets me look left and right, and the other option, it lets me look left and right. The other advantage of that is it's a whole lot easier for me to see servo glitching on the camera channel than it is on the aileron or the elevator channel. So if I'm flying away and then I start getting glitching on my control, you know, your servos will start jittering a little bit. The first thing you're going to notice is you're going to notice that camera kind of moving side to side, and that's going to be your indication that you need to probably turn around and start heading home. Now the servos, I think typical servos are about a 60-degree sweep on it. You can check my YouTube channel. I've got a video on how to modify the little HXT 900 servos to get a 180-degree sweep where you can look completely side to side, and you can also modify those to do a complete 360-degree sweep, so you can fly and you can spin your camera all the way around if you wanted to do that as well. Let's see. Okay, so now we got all of our equipment set up. What do you do next? Well, I would recommend taking your video equipment and setting it aside for now. If you're not 100% comfortable with your airplane, you're going to want to just fly that as much as you can and get used to it. Get used to it, get used to it, get used to it. You're going to want to learn its flight characteristics, its stall speeds. You're going to want to know how fast it'll fly, how slow it'll fly, any issues with its flying, any bad tendencies that the airplane's going to have. You really want to be comfortable with that before you start flying FPV, because that's not going to be the time to get into trouble and try to figure out what's going on with the airplane, because you're not going to be looking at the plane, you're going to be looking at the horizon. So you're going to want to know what those tendencies are so you can recognize them faster and correct properly, and not get a big case of dumb thumb where you start spinning sticks around while your plane is spinning in the ground. Don't ask me how I know that. So know the airplane, know what its flight characteristics are, and once you get there, then you can load your video equipment on board and start your FPV flying. Another really important thing to know before you start flying FPV is to get a good handle on range checking your equipment, how far your RC control system will work, and how far your video transmission system will work. Very, very, very important to not fly out of range of either one of those control systems, because if you do, you're not coming home. So range check, range check, range check. Always do your best. I know it's kind of a pain to do that sometimes, depending on where you're at, especially with the video transmitter. At least with your RC control system, you can usually put that in low power and range check that way. So just do your best to range check everything, and make sure when you range check that you range check your RC control system and your video system both on at the same time, because one could affect the other. So make sure everything's on when you're range checking. Okay, that said, know the limits of your electronics. Okay, when you get out to your field to start flying, it's going to be a good idea to have a buddy out there spotting for you when you first get started, because it's a really odd feeling to take your eyes off of your airplane and look at your monitor. You're going to want to go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. It's a bit unnerving committing to that monitor, going, this is what I'm flying off of, and it's really difficult to look at the monitor and look at the plane and look at the monitor and look at the plane. It's really difficult sometimes when you just take your eyes off your airplane for a second to find it in the sky again. So that's where your spotter is going to come in. If you get in trouble with the video, at least your spotter can point to where your plane is, or you can hand the transmitter off so you don't lose your equipment so early on in the hobby. So yeah, and also it's happened a number of times. It'll happen probably to everyone. At some point, you're going to have an FPV plane that goes down, and when that happens, it's a really, really, really good idea to have a spotter going. It's in there. It's there. It's really a good idea to have a. It's really going to be a good idea to have a spotter go. It's over there. It's right down there, and guide you to that airplane. Otherwise, you could be way farther away from where you think you went down. Let's see. So your spotter is going to be your best friend for the first couple of flights, and actually every flight if possible. As long as you're flying within line of sight, it's a good idea to have a spotter out there keeping an eye on that plane for you, for safety reasons, for a number of reasons. You want to have a set of eyes on the plane while you've got a set of eyes on your monitor. Your other best friend is going to be Google Earth. It's really important to check Google Earth and check your flight paths and kind of pre-plan your flights out. If you're going to fly from point A to point B, get on Google Earth, zoom in, look at the flying field, look at the locations you're going to be flying. They got some really good measuring tools where you can measure distances and you can check landmarks. You're going to want to know your landmarks, know how far they are away, know how far to fly and when to turn back. And Google Earth is outstanding for planning flights. It's really, really, really great tool. And if you can have it out at the field with you via wireless connection, that's even better. So use Google Earth. I guess the last thing that I wanted to talk about that I think it's important to keep track of is your weather conditions. You can obviously look out and see whether it's sunny or cloudy or whatever, but probably the most important thing is knowing what the wind is doing. There's probably nothing that's going to be worse than if you take off on a flight away from you and use up half a battery with a 10-mile-an-hour tailwind, and then you realize it's time to turn around and come home. Well, if you only have half a charge in your battery and you're flying home and now you've got a 10-mile-an-hour headwind, guess what's going to happen? You're going to run out of juice before you get home, and you're going to lose your plane. So just keep an eye on what the wind's doing, what your air speeds are, and whenever you're flying out, keep in mind that the further you go, the further you have to fly home. And you really want to pay attention to your battery power. You don't want to run that down to the wire. Always try to keep some juice in reserve for the unexpected. You can't go wrong with that. Well, lastly, I want to talk about recording your videos. It's going to be real important to record your videos, all of them, for a couple of reasons. Well, first of all, when you get that awesome video of you dodging trees and flying under tree limbs and skimming the treetops and all this cool stuff, you're going to want to post that on YouTube because I want to see it. But probably the most important reason for recording your flight is if you lose your plane, that's going to be your best chance of getting it back. Going back to that video, you'll be able to see hopefully landmarks that can lead you to about where your plane is. If you do have the OSD installed, it'll have all your OSD data recorded for you, so you can go back and you can look at that, and you'll be able to see at least a general location where your plane went down, and you'll get the best chance of recovering your equipment that way. So record your flights. You can record them to a laptop. You can record them. I recently picked this up on eBay. It's just a little Canon camcorder, and it's got a video in, so I can record all my flights on this. I mean, I picked this up for, I think I got one on eBay for $14. And it's battery operated. I can stick it in my flight box, plug it into my video receiver, and while I'm monitoring on my TV, I can also be recording the flight. Cheap insurance. Record your flights. Other than that, have fun. This is a interesting hobby. It's more difficult than I thought it would be, and the further you want to fly, it gets infinitely more difficult. When you commit to flying on your monitor, it's difficult at first, because you can trust your eyes to look at your plane. When you start flying FPV, you're putting all your trust in electronics, which can fail at any moment, really, and that gets my adrenaline going. So it's really fun. It's an awesome way to fly, and so if you get involved in it, please post some videos, send me the links to them. I always love seeing people's FPV systems, what kind of plane they're flying, what kind of hardware they're using, what kind of flights, what the scenery is around their area. So be sure to share that, because I'm sure lots of other people like to see that other than just me. So anyway, again, I'm not an expert at this. I'm just a novice, and this is kind of some of the information that I've picked up over the last year. If there are any questions or any corrections or any comments or anything like that, feel free to leave them in the comments down below, and I'll take a look at them. And other than that, have a great time. Have fun. Later.